Well, good morning and welcome to Knox College and to our day of Convocation. For those who do not know me, my name is John Vissers, and it's my privilege to serve as principal of Knox College. And as principal of the college, it's always a pleasure to welcome people into our space, into our college's life, and I'm pleased to do so this morning. This is the beginning of a great day in the life of the college. As you know, we are beginning to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the college, and tonight we will have the 175th Convocation at 1 Spadina Circle at the original home of Knox College from 1875 to 1915, so we're looking forward to that. But especially, this is a day for our graduands, those who will be graduating tonight, to celebrate them and to celebrate with our alumni. And I know that there are graduands and alumni, as well as board members, faculty, staff, who are with us this morning and who are part of this day. So it's good to welcome you and for us to be together. We have a full day of activity, but we look forward to all of it. And it's good to begin together this morning. I want to take a moment to welcome those who are joining us via the live streaming. There is live streaming both for this lecture this morning as well as the Convocation tonight will be live streamed. So if you are joining us via your computer or cell phone or whatever other device you may be logging on with, we welcome you and glad you're able to join us. Knox has done a lecture or workshop for many years as part of our Convocation exercises, and this year is no exception, and so we are delighted to welcome you to this Convocation lecture. And we are especially pleased this morning to welcome the Reverend Dr. Luke Powery as our lecturer and also as our Convocation speaker this evening. Dr. Powery is, as many of you know, the Dean of Duke University Chapel and serves also as Associate Professor of Homiletics at Duke Divinity School. He's a national leader in the theological study of preaching, of the art of preaching. He preaches regularly, I think most weeks, in the Duke Divinity Chapel, as well as churches throughout the United States and Canada, and indeed around the world. He's a keynote speaker and lecturer at educational institutions, at conferences, at symposia, and at retreats. His teaching and research areas are located at the intersection of preaching, worship, pneumatology, that is the spirit, the study of the spirit, and culture, and particularly expressions of the African diaspora. He has written 3 books: Spirit Speech, Lament, and Celebration in Preaching; Them Dry Bones, Preaching Death and Hope; and his latest book, Rise Up, Shepherd, Advent Reflections on the Spirituals. And I think all of them are back there on the table from our library, and I think if you wanted to get your own copy, you could probably do that pretty quickly by Amazon. We don't have copies to sell here today, but there are copies from our library. He's also the co-author of an introductory textbook on preaching, Ways of the Word, Learning to Preach for Your Time and Place, and is currently working on the second in the series of meditations on the spirituals, this time for the season of Lent. He is also the general editor, a general editor of a forthcoming 9-volume lectionary commentary series for preaching and worship titled Connections. And I think the first or second volume is out already, and there's 1 volume, actually 2 volumes back there on the table. Luke was ordained by the Progressive National Baptist Convention. He's served in an ecumenical chaplaincy in churches throughout Switzerland and Canada and the US. More about Canada in a minute. He's a member of the Academy of Homiletics, for which he has served as secretary. He's involved with the American Academy of Religion and the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Dr. Powery served as a member of the executive lectionary team for the African American Lectionary and is also the recipient of numerous scholastic fellowships and awards. In 2008, the African American Pulpit named him one of 20 outstanding Black ministers under the age of 40 who are helping shape the future direction of the church. More recently, in 2014, he was inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars at Morehouse College for his ethical and spiritual leadership in the academy, the church, and broader society. Prior to being at Duke, his appointment at Duke, he served at Princeton Seminary, where he was the Perry and Georgia Engel Assistant Professor of Homiletics at Princeton Theological Seminary. And that's where I had the privilege of first coming into contact with Luke. I first heard about him because he was a student of Paul Wilson's. And Luke did his doctorate here at the Toronto School of Theology in the graduate program, studying under Paul. And I was casting about looking for really good people to bring to Montreal when I was principal of the other college for continuing education. And Paul recommended Luke. And so we had Luke up that's probably about 7, 8, 9 years ago now. While he was with us, we had a really important meal together because my son, who was in his last year of university at that time, was trying to decide where to go to seminary. And he had a conversation with Luke, and at any rate, Grant ended up going to Princeton Seminary. And so Luke is actually was Grant's first homiletics professor. So Luke taught my son how to undo all the bad influence of his father. So we have that personal connection. And Luke was also taught our daughter-in-law, Connie. Grant and Connie met at Princeton, and so we're grateful for that personal connection and for the place, the part that Luke's played in the lives of our own family. He received a BA in music with a concentration in vocal performance from Stanford. He's a Stanford grad, MDiv from Princeton, a Princeton grad, and then his THD here from Emmanuel College and the University of Toronto. Luke is married to Gail Powery, and they together have 2 children. And so we are really delighted to have Luke with us. It's a real honor for us to have him, and especially since this is a second visit to Toronto in 2 months. He was here in March for a farewell event for Paul Wilson, who is retiring from Emmanuel. The topic of Luke's lecture today is preaching the gospel and the gift of tears. And he's going to come forward and give that lecture, and there'll be an opportunity for some questions and answers afterwards. We've built in lots of time for this before the luncheon starts. So let's welcome Luke Powery.
Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be back at U of T, as they say, and particularly to TST. I have so many wonderful memories of the 3 years that we actually lived. We lived in Oshawa when I was in the coursework part of the THD program, and just wonderful memories. My youngest son, who's 13 now, was born here, and so it's good to be here. And it's funny that one of the things in that bio, every time someone reads it, 2008, being noted as one of the ministers under 40. I'm no longer under 40, but I like to hear it every now and then. So thank you for the invitation, John, and it's a blessing to be here. It's interesting to be at Knox because I was telling some alumni earlier, Paul Wilson was my main advisor, but I had coursework with Art Van Cedars. principal emeritus here of Knox College, and Art also served on my dissertation committee, and we had a seminar, I know at least one seminar in this building. So it's good to be back among the Presbyterians. This lecture is in dedication or in memory of, in honor of Art Van Seters. And it's called Preaching the Gospel and the Gift of Tears. And to begin, what I would like to do is to put this portion of Scripture in the air for our imagination. And it's from Jeremiah. My joy is gone, grief is upon me, my heart is sick. Hark the cry of my poor people from far and wide in the land. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king not in her? Why have they provoked me to anger with their images, with their foreign idols? The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. For the hurt of my poor people, I am hurt. I mourn, and dismay has taken hold of me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. Preaching the gospel and the gift of tears. Soon will be done with the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. No more weeping and wailing, no more, oh, no more weeping and wailing, no more, oh, no more weeping and wailing, going home to live with God. Soon will be done with the troubles of the world, the troubles of this world, the the troubles of this world. Soon we'll be done with the troubles of the world. Going home to live with God. It was December 20th, 2005 in San Jose, California. 5 days before Christmas. The mall parking lots were full of people doing last-minute shopping. Churches were getting ready for an overflow crowd at Christmas Eve and Christmas Day services. You know what I'm talking about, pastors. Pastors were putting their best foot forward in their sermon preparations in anticipation of those who only attend church services once a year. People were excited for the advent of Christ. The party mood filled the air. I, on the other hand, was getting ready for something else, not the celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ, but the lament of the death of my 10-year-old niece, Christiana, who died from a rare disease that shortens the life of 3 out of 1 million children. At the end of her life, IV needles were her nails, a hospital bed her cross. There I was, a minister of the gospel, even more importantly, Uncle Luke, preparing to officiate the graveside ceremony of my niece. Like Jesus, who wept at the tomb of Lazarus, causing onlookers to say, "See how he loved him," we wept at the tomb of Christiana as a sign of our love for her. Or as Nicholas Wolterstorff says in his book, Lament for a Son, every lament is a love song. However, it appeared that not everyone present at the cemetery sang this same song of the Spirit. There were those, even ordained ministers and preachers of the gospel, who appeared to be afraid to lament and allow the Spirit to groan through them. By their overemphasis on celebrating the fact that my niece was now in glory in heaven with God, they highlighted the hope of the resurrection and Easter, but they ignored the lament of the Good Friday crucifixion. They were pleased for personal salvation to be heaven-bound, which seemed to me to be no good to those of us left on earth to weep the loss of Christiana. This sermonic altar call in front of my niece's casket caused me not only to weep over losing her, but to weep the loss of lament, the Spirit song. On this day, lament was taken off of life support and died, because the life of the Spirit was quenched and squeezed out of that sermonette. There was no sense that the Spirit manifests through laments and not solely celebrations. Thus, the breath of expression found in the Spirit was absent, because no sign of lament was present in this sermon at the graveside, due to it being disturbingly overwhelmed with celebrations for those who raise their hands to take the heaven-bound train. It was as if Christiana's life of love didn't even matter and was not going to be missed. Did Christiana just die, or what? Why, even at a graveside service, are some Christians afraid to lament and engage in the sighs of the Spirit? Have they forgotten that lament is a love song to the one who laments for us? Have they forgotten what the Apostle Paul teaches, that the Spirit groans? Which raises the question for us today: does your gospel groan? I recognize that talking about groaning may not help you in your church growth initiatives. or even seem appropriate for convocation activities. And as students graduate, groaning is not popular, yet it is part of the gospel. And without it, we may preach an anorexic gospel, thin on truth and reality. In a 2006 Religion and Ethics News Weekly interview, legendary prince of the pulpit, Gardner Taylor, was asked to assess the current preaching scene. And what he says is illuminating then and super relevant for today as well. This is what he says. There is now a tendency, I think, more than ever, to make preaching a kind of Sunday chamber of commerce exercise. Motivational speaking, which has its place, but it is not the gospel. It becomes a kind of opium, if opium is a stimulant for people, which gives them often a false notion of what life is all about. I think much of contemporary preaching doesn't prepare people for the inevitable crises of life. When we talk constantly about prosperity, well, life is not constantly prosperity. It has adversity and difficulties. And if one is trained, conditioned to see only the bright side of things, then one is not prepared for living in this world. Of course, Taylor continues, people want to hear it because candy is a very pleasant thing. My daughter, when she was a little girl, I suppose we could have fed her candy morning, noon, and night, and she would have taken it morning, noon, and night and enjoyed it. But soon she would have had no teeth, and soon we would have had no daughter. You know, candy is wonderful, and I love it, but one needs in one's diet more than candy. I mean, Taylor's notion that a prosperity-only message is like candy suggests that this preaching is initially sweet to the taste, a pleasant thing, but in the end, it is detrimental because life is not just about the bright side of things. If one chews on a prosperity message long enough, one will end up with no teeth because one needs in one's diet more than candy. Prosperity preaching may be sweet like a candy cane at first, but it will eventually be sour for the soul and bad for one's spiritual teeth and nerve. Candy homiletical theology doesn't sustain people's lives in the end because it doesn't take into consideration what life is all about. It doesn't groan. The hardships and pain of life tend to be muted in this bright, sunny gospel, ignoring the fact that the Spirit led Jesus into a wilderness and Ezekiel to a valley of dry bones, a place of contamination and death. Living and preaching the gospel in the Spirit entails suffering, pain, struggle, and groans. Many times people preach through pain and preach to pain. And there will not only be groaning, but grieving and weeping. Groaning, grieving, and weeping occur just by living. You never prayed for it in the midnight hour or fasted for it for 40 days and 40 nights. It just happens because cow manure happens. When I think about grief and weeping, I also think of Haiti, who over 9 years ago experienced one of the most devastating earthquakes in its history. When it comes to Haiti, there are many things that can be said. Duke Professor Laurent Dubois argues that earthquakes, not just literal ones, have hit Haiti throughout history. Thus, he can speak of the aftershocks of history. We should remember those affected by a devastating earthquake 9 years ago, but it behooves us to remember that Haiti as a nation was devastated long before that particular earthquake. This is why former Prime Minister Michel Pierre-Louis compares Haitians to Sisyphus, a mortal who in the Greek myth is condemned by the gods to endlessly roll a rock up a mountain, only to have it fall back down again. And each time the rock rolls down the mountain, he pushes it up, and in the most optimistic telling of the story, he hopes that it will be the final time. The earthquake has not been the only heavy burden of the people of Haiti. Pierre-Louis says in the same interview, from the native Tainos, who were wiped out by the Spaniards after decades of battle, to the enslaved Africans who defeated the French and created the world's first Black republic, only to invite the world's scorn, to the millions of current residents of tent cities, survivors of the worst natural disaster to have struck the country in its entire history. Haitians our Sisyphean, and much more. Even after the 2010 earthquake, there was money promised for the reconstruction of the nation, but it didn't make it to the right, just hands. I remember Haiti this morning. I remember those lives lost and families affected by the earthquake, and those who still sit in mourning every morning with tears as their food day and night. There are some who can't shake the earthquake. We remember those who hurt and mourn for their loved ones, those injured due to the earthquake, those who died, and those who have never been found. We remember the grief-stricken father who, days after the earthquake, stood in front of the remnants of his house where his son's body was buried in the rubble and had to tell his other son, Gibson is in the hole and we can't do anything for him. We remember Sebastian Delatour's family. Sebastian was 14 years old when the earthquake hit, and he heard his mother screaming as she ran outside. His sister was taking a shower and had fallen and hit her head. And then he heard the tragic news that his grandparents' house had collapsed on them while they watched TV. They died instantly. There was so much grief and death that filled the land of Haiti during that time that Sebastian, a 14-year-old, declared it smelled like death, and we all cried. Even in the United States, grief seems to be perpetual in the hearts of many mothers who've lost their Black sons because they've been shot by police. I mean, we shouldn't have to create hashtags to recognize that all human lives matter, because there isn't this recognition. Grief over the last few years has gone viral in 140 Twitter characters, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And the weeping prophet Jeremiah understood grief as well. I mean, I know they say Jeremiah was a bullfrog and he always had a mighty fine time singing joy to the world. But Jeremiah of the Old Testament is very different. That Jeremiah talks about joy, but this Jeremiah, who we heard some words from this morning, says, my joy is gone, grief is upon me, my heart is sick. He voices this trilogy of agony, and some even suggest that those words might actually be God speaking, because you do know that God suffers, right? I mean, within romanticized and traditional notions of masculinity, we hear real men don't cry. Some tank top muscle shirt wearing churches endorse this machismo mentality, though the gospel speaks of finding strength in weakness. I mean, God even suffers and God weeps, even as we hear in the shortest verse of the Bible that Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. I mean, Jeremiah is a prophet who weeps. So don't underestimate tears. They may not mean what you think, and they may come without warning. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, recalls when his mother died at the age of 56, when he was 33 years old. He was by her side when she expired her last breath. He closed her eyes and said a great wave of sorrow surged into his heart. Tears started to come, but he stemmed the flow. He writes about this, and then the tears dried up. He thought it was more mature to put his sobs in check and not to mark his mother's death in that way, because it was not total extinction or misery, since she was a woman of faith. He fought back against the wave of emotional sorrow and didn't even shed a tear at the burial ground. But it wasn't until he woke up the next morning that he wept for her and himself, and he writes this: the tears which I have been holding back streamed down, and I let them flow as freely as they would, making of them a pillow for my heart. His heart, and on them, he continues, on them it rested. His heart rests on a pillow of tears. His heart rests on grief. That same morning, he was comforted by St. Ambrose's evening hymn, which declares that God will gently soothe the careworn breast and lull our anxious griefs to rest. I mean, there's something about a mother's death that grieves the human heart, perhaps because it is the loss of our first home in the womb. I mean, in the end, Augustine could not stop his grief or his tears, though he seems to still struggle with its role in the spiritual life. I mean, groaning grief seems to be the ongoing theme in the world. I've seen the choreography of grief on display at vigils for those who have been killed by gun violence in Durham and in other cities, and even the grief at funerals of loved ones, especially of children. I mean, some faint in overwhelming sorrow for a life cut too short. Others bawl like the Old Testament figure, Rachel, weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Some swallow their tears in silent numbness at what appears to be the death of humanity's future. Some may want to jump into the casket of the child who is no more as an attempt to reverse life's inhumane joke that has gone sorely wrong. So grief is oral and visual, choreographed by the spirit of a broken world. And we observe and hear the grief of Jeremiah in what I read. It's not a pretty sight. The pages of scripture of his particular story are soaked with sorrow and lament. He is moaning his mourning. Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. It's embodied grief, a grief that terrorizes the body, his eyes, his head, and it reshapes the contours of one's life, like when a Philadelphia mother discovered two children locked in a car trunk, suffocated by mistake while playing an innocent game. The choreography of grief at that moment is unforgettable to me. Joy was gone, and her heart was sick. The terror of grief erupted the fountain of tears from her heart, and it was an observable and obvious grief. In his personal journal, published as A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis pens the shape of his grief in the wake of the death of his wife, Joy Davidman. Again, it was that C word, not curse word, but cancer. Cancer and cancer and cancer, he writes. My mother, my father, my wife. I wonder who is next in the queue. The presence of the absence was so poignant that Lewis writes, her absence is like the sky spread over everything. Grief takes over his life to such an extent that he declares, I am a death's head. Again, somatic grief, embodied grief, just like Jeremiah. I mean, Publishers Weekly, that periodical magazine, notes that sales for books on grief do pretty well. Grief sells well as people try to discover how best to deal with it. But I'm not sure the book of Jeremiah has sold as well, especially his Lamentations, because we struggle with the role of grieving or weeping in gospel preaching. And so we avoid prophets like Jeremiah. I mean, everybody wants to rush to proof text Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Yet I don't hear anyone who tries to memorize at bedtime what he says in chapter 8. We look for peace, but find no good, for a time of healing, but there is terror instead. I mean, that was the state of the people in Jerusalem. I don't hear anyone quoting the lament of the people. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. Jeremiah is a weeping prophet who doesn't make financial profits. He doesn't have a bright smile or slick hair or tell funny stories in a huge auditorium. Tears are his breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But his tears may not be what you think. There's something compelling, something honest, something real and raw about Jeremiah's descent into the shadow of a people's darkness. Far too long, certain sectors of religion have attempted to avoid the abyss. But Jeremiah reveals the truthful necessity of facing the abyss along a trail of tears. Why? Because grief is a part of the gospel story. The prophet's oracles indict and sentence Jerusalem for its disobedience to God's law. His speeches anticipate the destruction of Jerusalem. This is the reason for his grief, joylessness, heart sickness, and mourning. And the people experience a sense of abandonment and loneliness. God seems to be in absentia. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king not in her? Or in the words of C.S. Lewis, why is God so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent a help in time of trouble? I mean, it is the piercing question of lamentation that God even asks God, my God, why have you forsaken me? It is a blues-inflected interrogation. Where is God? Old Testament scholar Stephen Breck Reed writes, the crucible of laments is to trust in God even in the face of the apparent absence of God and the presence of the enemies. I mean, funny enough, the people in the context of Jeremiah are not the only ones questioning. God also has God's own question. Why have they provoked me to anger with their images, with their foreign idols? The irony is actually that the Lord is in Zion. Even though the people question, is the Lord in Zion? The Lord is in Zion and has his own questions for the people. Based on what God says, this is actually a situation of self-imposed exile and hurt based on the choices of people. I mean, the situation is so grim that Jeremiah sings out his own blues note. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Later in the book of Jeremiah, we hear about restoration. But in this specific moment, he doesn't distance himself from the hurt and sorrow of his people. He is not afraid to cry. Oh, men don't cry, they say. But prophets do. For the hurt of my poor people, I am hurt, I mourn, and dismay has taken hold of me. His tears form a path of solidarity and suffering. Don't underestimate tears. They may not mean what you think. I mean, the challenge is to see hope while traveling on the trail of tears. Jeremiah reveals the gift of tears, I think, affirming what UCLA clinical professor of psychiatry, Dr. Judith Orloff, teaches. Professor Orloff gets excited about people crying because she's witnessed the healing power of tears. Tears are a release valve for stress and grief and anxiety and frustration and joy. Tears are a way to purge pent-up emotions so that they do not remain in the body as stress symptoms. Tears lubricate and cleanse our eyes so that they do not get irritated or infected. And after crying many times, our heart rate can decrease and we enter a calmer state. Reflex, continuous, and emotional tears make us feel better, physically and emotionally. So crying can be thought of as a physiological and emotional detox through which one can be healed. Thus, Dr. Orloff warns not to hold back the tears because it is healthy to cry. A Yiddish proverb says, what soap is for the body, tears are for the soul. Don't underestimate tears. They may not mean what you think. I mean, there's much fruit from tears and grief. Jeremiah reveals that tears are a gift because they embody the prophetic ministry of grief. Tears have a prophetic ministry. The office of the prophet was to be ultimately to be a gift for the welfare and well-being of the nation, which is why Jeremiah asks, why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? As a prophet, Jeremiah not only stands over against them as a mouthpiece of God, but he stands with them. in mourning and grief at their impending funeral. He sheds a fountain of tears as an aspect of his prophetic work. His grief is prophetic because he refuses to be silent in the face of horror and terror and injustice. The word is like fire shut up in his bones. And so he doesn't shrink back from voicing the raw grief of life. There is passionate candor. Prophetic grief is a form of lament that boldly proclaims life is not right. Tears can represent a torn heart, but this type of tear-filled grief and crying in pathos is the ultimate form of criticism, according to Walter Brueggemann. One may shed tears because one refuses to shrink back from struggle and pain. Joy is gone, but gospel hope is not. Prophetic grief tells it like it is. This ministry of grief is the embrace of weeping and lamentation as a part of our spiritual, homiletical, liturgical repertoire, and in the process helps others engage their experiences of suffering honestly, rather than respond with numbness, fear, self-deception, and a denial of reality. Prophetic grief is poetic and can be a theological chronicle of communal catastrophe expressed lyrically. Jeremiah realized the words of this hymn, "We have come over a way that with tears has been watered." Jeremiah isn't afraid to name his and his people's sorrows. Every teardrop is a prophetic act of resistance against the way life is and a prayer for something better because of his faith in God. Prophetic grief does not leave God off the hook either. It actually interrogates the goodness of God. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Questioning God is a part of our Christian spirituality in which we recognize that many times there are more questions than answers, and it takes courage to ask God anything, especially when we may not receive the answer we want or any answer at all. But prophet Jeremiah still courageously asks questions because he believes so deeply in the loving reality of God. He doesn't ask in unbelief. He asks because he believes with deep abiding faith. He asks, is there no balm in Gilead? Because he does believe God is present, though he experiences theological dissonance in that he can't make sense of the hurt of his people. Yet he hopes, because there is a sense that catastrophic events do not undermine the credibility of God. Prophets are prisoners of hope, not just bearers of bad news. Their tears are rooted in a hope in God. When Jeremiah is called, he's called to pluck up and pull down, to build and to plant, judgment and restoration, warnings of doom, but always followed by promises of hope. The prophetic ministry of grief is hopeful. Those who do not grieve cannot truly hope. The tears flowing from Jeremiah's head are not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength of spirit in the spirit. All of this weeping and lamentation we hear from Jeremiah does not represent an erosion of hope, but necessary elements of hope. If one does not experience some form of grief or suffering, hope is not necessary, because what are you hoping for then? In Augustinian fashion, tears form a pillow, and on them, gospel hope rests. Tears are a part of the texture of hope. And if you think back to earlier in the book of Jeremiah, we hear that God refers to God's self as a fountain of living water. And the people use cracked cisterns that can hold no water. This suggests that God is our living water source, and apart from God, we will be dry and thirsty. Interestingly, Jeremiah is full of water, as his head is a spring of water, his eyes a fountain of tears. His weeping then suggests the presence of God. That is, that God is in his tears, in the water of holy weeping, in the grief. According to Alan Jones, Dean Emeritus of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, the gift of tears is like the breaking of the waters of the womb before the birth of a child, before a new birth. That means that hope is tear-stained. If not, it is not real hope or the gospel, because tears sow the seeds of hope. These tears are sacramental not only as a sign of God's presence, but as a sign of our own baptism, the waters of the Spirit's washing. So God is in our tears. The Reverend Peter Gomes, the former minister at Harvard's Memorial Church, had some very interesting things to say about hope. And in what became his last book, The Scandalous Gospel of Jesus, he reminds us that hope is not the opposite of suffering. Suffering is the necessary antecedent of hope, because in and through suffering, hope manifests. He continues, a hope worth having is forged upon the anvil of adversity. Hope is the stuff that gets us through and beyond when the worst that can happen happens. Hope, he writes, is not merely the optimistic view that somehow everything will turn out all right in the end if everyone just does as we do. Hope is the more rugged view that even if things don't turn out all right and aren't all right, we endure through and beyond the times that disappoint or threaten or destroy us. In other words, Durham, North Carolina's own Episcopal priest, Pauli Murray, as she has said, hope is a song in a weary throat. Or as pastor emeritus of Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California, J. Alfred Smith has proclaimed, hope is a tiny sprout growing in cracked concrete. That means the tears, the suffering, the weary throat, the cracked concrete is the setting out of which hope is born. Hope comes amid our grief, despite our grief, but not without it. Hope is tinged with the ashes of despair, and hope resides in the ruins, even in the milieu of historical human slavery. It is still so mind-boggling to me that the gift of the musical genre called the spirituals, and I sang a spiritual at the beginning, the spirituals, that the gift of these songs were given in the bosom of inhumane slavery. That, as James Weldon Johnson from the Harlem Renaissance era pens, that the fiery spirit of the seer should call these simple children of the sun and soil. That though these Black slave singers were gone, forgot, unfamed, untaught, unknown, unnamed, their songs still live, and they touch the chords of our human hearts today. That somehow when we find ourselves in the home of grief and declare, my heart is sick, like the prophet, at such times as we experienced in the United States several years ago at the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre, where there were 27 deaths several years in Newtown, Connecticut, we turned to a spiritual at the chapel, at Duke Chapel, such as the balm in Gilead, to grieve and hope at the same time. This music created in the womb of melancholic misery straightens out Jeremiah's question and turns it into an exclamation point. Jeremiah asked, is there no balm in Gilead? This spiritual says, there is a balm in Gilead. A creative note of triumph in the midst of any type of terror. Not happiness, not joy, but hope. Someone has commented that Jeremiah was like a wounded animal, but his wounds did not win, nor did the wounds of God destroy God. Rather, his cruciform wounds, his teardrops of blood, were the balm for the healing of the world, including our own. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. And the balm in Gilead may be the spiritual itself, a song, a melody, a tear. Don't underestimate tears, because they may not mean what you think. They may actually reveal that you are a prophet. And those who sow in tears will reap in hope. And hope, according to poet Emily Dickinson, is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Dr. Powery, for a powerful presentation. We have a few minutes and we can invite questions or comments. Dr. Powery, I think, is willing to engage in a bit of conversation. Let's start over here. Harris? We're going to use the mic just so those who are online can hear.
I guess the first thing I want to say is that was a beautiful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thinking about Jeremiah and the congregational study we did and some of the literature around complicated grief, because of course with Jeremiah you've got certainly the grief, you've got the anger, you've got expressions of hate, a lot of judgment, and so what happens when the grief and how anger can actually undermine grief? It can become destructive as much as there is a place for it as well. And how, you know, the grieving is a journey that has to also deal with those things that we recognize are wrong, and certainly with God's relationship with the people of Israel. So I don't know if you'd have some thoughts and comments around that.
Yes, grief is complicated. I think most definitely, I mean, one of the key things I think you said there is how grief is a journey. And everyone processes grief differently. And it takes twists and turns in different ways for different people. So there isn't, you know, we check this box and we've done grief right, or, you know, grief is over, A, B, and C, and we're done. Oh, that it was that easy, right? And so I think you are right that anger, the questioning, all of the things that you mentioned are a part of even a grieving process. And it could manifest in anger, it could manifest in a kind of, for some, even in a kind of comedic way, in a sense of laughter. Again, people handle grief in a different way. And so there is a deep, I think, awareness. I mean, what you're pointing to me is sort of an awareness of its complications. Not that there's a simple answer, but that case by case, people by people, community by people, how the process should happen towards healing or towards hope is going to be varied. I think that's, you know, that's my response to, I don't think it's a one size fits all. But I think what I was also trying to get to is often we don't, in the church at times, yes, somebody dies, you know, you're grieving a loved one, and that in a pastoral care sense, helping someone take that journey, which, you know, the presence of the absence is something that will never go away. And sometimes that presence is stronger than the real body that might be in front of you. And so I think how we handle individuals and communities becomes an act of great pastoral care and compassion, but yet the fruit that one grieves is important rather than to control or try to control it. But somehow to ask God, it's such a spiritual journey to enter the grief, even the grief of God. You know, God wept at the tomb of Lazarus, and how liberating, even in my own thinking of the linking between grief or lamentation, depending on how it plays out in love, has been so helpful. And then another thing, this is off your question, but it just reminded me of coming out of Easter. How many survived? I guess you're here, you survived Holy Week. We're still standing. Is thinking about the presence of the absence. So that could be people, that could be some gap in our life, whatever, that somehow that empty hole in our life, a person or a thing or a place, something that is that empty hole is somehow a memory of the empty hole of the open tomb. That when we lose a loved one and that room is still there and it still has their clothes hanging but that person is no longer there, that empty space, may it call us to remember the empty tomb. And so this idea that the grieving still has a sensibility of perhaps hope in Christ, that the hole that is the gaping hole that is in our own lives, may it call us to remember the open tomb and how that the open tomb is the womb for our future, propelling us that the future is open. And I think this is so much connected to, I think, the grieving or the emptiness that we may have or people may experience for different reasons. Yeah. Thank you for that comment.
I want to thank you too for this lecture, and it's very meaningful to me because I have been thinking about hope. And I want to start by saying that I was at a Good Friday service which started with a poem by a Canadian poet. And the last line of the short poem on Good Friday was, "And our Lord went winking to his grave." And I was shocked. In fact, I sat through the whole service. The rest of it was fine. But I felt, where is Good Friday? So this kind of superficial way that we rush to resurrection and hope bothered me. And then just after that, I read Miguel de la Torre's latest book on hopelessness. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that.
Not yet, yeah.
But it was very challenging. I'm a big Moltmann fan, and it's the first time in my life that I have read a really good critique of Moltmann. And basically, he identifies the problem as hope. Hope is the problem when it comes to the weak and the powerless and those who suffer. And that hope is an opium. Hope is a sedative that keeps us from acting in situations that will remain hopeless and it won't change. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, hope is an opium. It can be. It can be. And you know what? I think that's the harsh reality, what you said there, that there are things that we have worked towards, prayed for, desired, worked in our churches and the communities, and yet the change never comes, or the change as we've imagined never really comes. I think there's something about the truth about that. At the same time, my sort of thinking about hope is that it is definitely not the view of, it's trying to hold together crucifixion, resurrection, and the tears, right, and the the triumph. It's not disconnected. I think of the enslavement. I think of the enslavement of African peoples, and some of my work in the spirituals is, and why I bring them often into a room with song is, here are the enslaved. I mean, these are very different even from the slave narratives. People who were post-slavery, former slaves, Frederick Douglass and other people, the enslaved songs that we today, sung all over the world, that somehow we can sit at their feet, learn about God, the Bible, life, wisdom. They have no degrees from Knox College, right? But yet we can hear the inhumanity, but yet it's those who were dehumanized, and somehow these songs humanize us. And so for me, the hope, what Pauli Murray, hope is a song in a weary throat. I think the songs themselves are an expression of hope. That they sing, not even thinking about the lyrics, that they still sung, that we still sing, I would say that we still preach, is a sign that God hasn't given up on us, is a sign of the Spirit. If I think musically, if I'm just to go with that, if I think about what it takes to sing, the vocal cords, the saliva, baptism, the power of the voice is breath, ruach, spirit. If I start making those connections, that we still sing is a sign that God hasn't given up on us, is a sign of hope for me. Now, and the hope is less in this situation, anticipated change. It's more a deep sense of hope in God, who ultimately is our eternal home. And so, but I do think, Miguel, is, you know, because people can create this sense of hope, and it's cheap hope, because people don't want to often deal with the tough stuff, the realities, and you jump over the Good Friday and you just end through Holy Saturday and you just get to resurrection. It is true. Every Sunday is a little Easter. You know, resurrection is life. It's not just a one-time event. I mean, but at the same time, yes, it's too easy to, even in conversations, to talk about reconciliation. This is the critique but nobody wants to talk about truth-telling, justice, history. We just want to jump to forgiveness without actually doing the hard work of grief. You got to travel the trail of tears to get to hope. That's why I love the hymn, we have come, lift every voice and sing. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. So it's like tears is the foundation of life. And so the idea of truth-telling, the idea of acknowledging the pain, the idea of acknowledging the struggle, which is why I love Augustine's image. His tears flowed so freely, they formed a pillow, and on them his heart rests. So his heart, the foundation of his life, is rested on this pillow of tears. So I think, what would it be for theological education, to rest on a pillow of tears and move us forward in a hopeful way, whatever that might mean, into the future. But I do think, yeah, there's tension there. I mean, which is what Miguel is critiquing, for sure. There's definitely tension. And I would say on that point, we can't create hope. We're not the creators of hope. I mean, hope is linked to the Spirit, and it's not something we create. You know, that sense of hope is not something it's not a human creation. That's what I would want to say.
So a word of gratitude again to you. And so when I'm in an academic setting like this, I understand and I appreciate. When I go home to the congregation I serve in an affluent community that is struggling and scared and sad of the end of Christendom, to try and come in and preach and teach the power and necessity of lament scares all sorts of stuff out of them, because it's going to make us look weak, and it's going to make us look depressed, and it's going to make us look sad. And that's not what we want to offer the world. We want people to come in because we're happy and we have hope and we have the joy of Jesus down, down, down in our hearts. So, right? So we've started to practice lament, particularly around traumas in the world, acts of terrorism.
Yeah.
But when I do it too often, I start getting a bit of pushback that I don't come to church to be sad. I'm sad the rest of the week. I come to church to get my opium. Or whatever.
Sure.
So can you comment on that from like
yeah.
a practical theological perspective? How do we start
Yeah.
or continue to encourage the church around this?
I think one helpful way to begin, because many churches and congregations and people, the Psalms, the book of Psalms are so beloved in many ways. But what is often not really highlighted or talked about are the lament Psalms. 1/3 of the Psalter are laments. And laments are, except like Psalm 88 doesn't, most of the sort of traditional Old Testament scholars, Westermann and Brueggemann follows that whole line, Patrick Miller, the idea that most of these Psalms move from, they would say, plea to praise. They have this movement, right? And even Psalm 22, which was in the mouth of Jesus, has that movement. And so if people that Clifton Black, who teaches at Princeton Seminary, it's this quote I can't forget. He says that hope is the spine of lament. So the idea that even your laments, now in not in the sense, oh, I'm just lamenting, but the biblical sense, the psalm in the mode of the Psalms, there is a deep sense of truth-telling, honesty, anger, questioning. What kinds of teaching can happen? My point is, practically, are there, whether it's small groups or classes or sermon series, or how do you help people open up to say, yeah, the Psalms are not just about praise, right? They're also about lament. So how do we open, and it's a bulk of them, to help people understand, to say, look, there's a full range of expressions in the Christian life before God. And so what we're doing, it's not about being sad. It's about being honest before God. It's about, this is a part of your spirituality or life of faith, and it's significant. And I think for me, that's been one of the gaps, because it is true. People, I've heard they don't want to come, and what's happened in the United States the last couple of years, and even last calendar year, 2018 at Duke University Chapel, and guest preachers. And it's such a tense time in the nation. All of that bleeds over into the life of the university and in the chapel. And people are very sensitive about different things that might have been mentioned in the pulpit, even in passing, lamenting, telling truth about certain things going on in society. And it wasn't a whole political rant, but people get uncomfortable because they think, I live lament every day. So on Sunday morning, I want an opium, right? I avoid it, escape. And so we don't want to have a kind of liturgical escapism happening. We want it to be real, and hopefully usher people into God's presence. But that reality is there's suffering, there's pain, and until you really acknowledge that and embrace that and understand that, I don't think you can really move into the robust hope of God. But practically, I think, is there a series or something that could be done around the lament Psalms, linking that to music, prayers, other things, to help people really teach, to help people understand that this is a part, I'm not making this up. And lament is hope-filled. That one laments. That one, what does Emily Town say? Basically every cry to God, right, is a cry of trust. It's you're even my God, why have you forsaken me? God is still my God, right? The questioning, the anger, there's still a relationality there. There's not a distance. It's my God. And so to help people understand that this is a part of my relationship with God, or can be. It doesn't mean it's every day, but we shouldn't ignore it, right? To be what Don Salyers talks about, being at full stretch before God. So how do we help our people understand what it means to live into a full doxological life, which is not just the celebrations, but it's also the laments, to have a robust, full breadth of expressions. I think that's the challenge, in certain circles, for sure. Mhm.
Again, thank you. I'm just curious about the whole piece of the last question, and was wondering, is part of that we are forgetting how to give our testimonies? I was recently taken by a friend to a place called Ginny's Supper Club in Harlem, and did not expect to be going to church, and I did. I don't know if you've ever been there,
No,
but there's phenomenal music. But one of the performers, who happened also to be a first responder in her day job, who was singing, and I forget which song it was, and she gave her testimony in the middle of it, and she said, I wallowed in my pain because I knew God was there holding me, and then went forward to tell about her journey back. So just wondering about if we're trying, I think what I'm hearing is that we have been trying to make it a corporate lament. And although there's a corporate element, maybe we're forgetting to share our testimonies.
Yeah, that's good. Each other's stories, right? Do we know the stories of the people who are even in our congregations? I mean, I think that storytelling or the testimony, because I think that begins to broaden how, to hear all of this wide array of experience, what's going on in the life of people. And I mean, testimony, depending on what you mean by that, I mean, is really what you've seen and heard, right? What God is doing. It turns to God. It's not just about yourself, but just the idea of knowing the people's stories, to hear them might be, I think, a helpful, or I don't know what that looks like, or what the space is, what space can be created, so that people, I think that's so true. Because often, I mean, but that's true, right? Through our whole lives, even if we're married, our spouses, you may be married however long, but you're always learning something new. There will be things that you learn 30 years down the road. It's like, I never knew that. But I think that's the beauty of our common humanity, and the gift God has given us in one another, is get to know each other. Because isn't that the deep human need and desire? Not only to know and to love, but to be known and loved, right? Without judgment, of course. But I think this testimony, this storytelling, actually may be an avenue where we recognize, might be a space where hope can be created. A sense that it's a communal hope. That we're in this together. We're the body of Christ. Oh, wow, you learn about, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And human connections start being made with each other, in a way that hasn't happened, perhaps.
We have time maybe for one more question.
This is not a question. This is a story. I spent 2 summers in Malawi training grief counselors for AIDS orphans. And I made a connection there with an elderly woman named Faith, who has stayed in my circle. And I suggested to her one day that they tried to start some grandmothers groups so that people could support one another. And she started 3. So she had about 75 women involved in these. But she's a dear soul, and she's a farmer's wife. And sometimes we send money out to help buy grain for her grannies. Just this last 2 weeks, this is your presentation this morning, has been the second of challenges around tears. Because she has written me since the big storm in Malawi and Mozambique. And she says that, yes, their houses are damaged and so on. And that was one email. And then she says, and of course, the storm took away all our crops. So we have no food to eat. And she talks often about weeping. And it's a bit humorous for me because she says, the tears flow down my cheeks. She means her cheeks, but they flow down her cheeks. And she said, we must weep. We must cry many, many tears. And I just thought, yes, there's a circumstance where there is no choice but to weep, and that the hope has to come from what God will give them in terms of hope. So.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, one of the things is that with that story, and back to hope and real hope and change, maybe that's really sometimes all we have is the notion, that at least that I was trying to point to in Jeremiah, that God is in our tears. And those tears are a sign of the waters of our baptism and being claimed and loved by God. And maybe we don't see the things shifting in the way, but somehow the tears that flow are a sign of God's presence with us still. And that's ultimately our hope, that God is with us.
Luke, thank you very much.
Thank
I'm going
you.
to ask Stuart to come forward in a moment and express formal thanks on behalf of the college.
Yeah.
But before he does that, I just want to add my own word. I was reminded this morning as I was listening to your lecture of just how what we bring into a room ourselves, and preachers know this well, that there are all kinds of people sitting before you who come with their own thoughts, experiences into the room. And as you were speaking, I was constantly casting my mind back to last Saturday, where I was in London, Ontario, and had the privilege of participating there in a workshop and seminar on the 25th anniversary of the celebration, or the acknowledgement of the 25th anniversary of the Presbyterian Church in Canada's apology, confession to Indigenous peoples. For residential schools and for a variety of other things. And in fact, George Vise is here this morning. He was moderator of the General Assembly in 1994 when that confession was issued. But we spent the day with, there were a group of Presbyterians and a group of Indigenous people. And we were talking, sharing stories, and the idea of lament and tears appeared a number of times. And we're so quick to, I think, we want to offer an apology, we want to fix it, we want to get on with it, we want to move toward reconciliation, all of which are good things. But one of the things that we were reminded of is that one of the things we were invited to do by our Indigenous sisters and brothers was to lament with them. That is to enter into the pain and the grief and the tears, that's a part of the process of the journey. And without that, the other things don't happen. And so just that was the filter through which I was hearing some of what you were saying this morning and reflecting on it in terms of the significance for the work and the call that certainly we have here in this, in our church and in this college and going forward in this country. So thank you.
Yeah,
I'm going to invite Stuart to come and say a formal word of thanks.
I'm going to keep it very brief. That was incredibly rich. And I think we're all out of our different situations and different contexts as ministers, as professors, as church people, going to go away and think more about what you've said to us and the power, as John has said, of lamenting. How do we sing songs? Are we comfortable in minor keys, or do we always have to put it into a major key? Those of us who participate in any way in a praise band know that a lot of the music's happy. What about including some of the stuff that comes out of the Psalms that is more real? And so I think those are all things to really think about. So thank you very much. And I want to end with the words that as I was going through it, dedicating this to Dr. Arthur Van Cedars, he would be very proud and pleased and he would be the first one to want to applaud and thank you. So thank you very much.